Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being here for this webinar on the impact of the coronavirus pandemic on the Australian economy. For those of you who are joining us from Hong Kong or Singapore or places in those time zones, good morning to you. And to anyone who's watching a recording of this, perhaps you're in Europe or North America or Latin America, and obviously don't want to be up at some ungodly hour of the morning, well, thank you for watching this whenever you're watching it. I'm now going to share my screen so that you can see the slides that I intend to work through. Before I go on to the substance of the presentation, however, let me stress, as I always do, that nothing that you're about to hear in this webinar constitutes investment advice, and it shouldn't be construed as such. If you think I've given you an investment tip, then you almost certainly haven't understood what I've said. And before you make any investment decisions, you should consult with your own personal financial advisor who understands your personal circumstances, and you should see anything I'm saying today as being very much of a general nature rather than specific to your personal circumstances. Turning to the impact of that on the world economy, of course, all of the major international forecasting agencies, the IMF, the World Bank and the OECD, and our own Treasury, all saying that this is going to be the worst year for global growth since the 1930s, the year of the Great Depression. They differ as to whose experience is going to be worse. For example, the OECD is more bearish about the outlook for China. Too bearish in my view. I think China will have positive growth on average for 2020, as the IMF and World Bank see. On the other hand, the IMF is more bearish about the outlook for Japan, for example. Sorry, less bearish about the outlook for Japan than the World Bank or the OECD is. But they're all forecasting pretty substantial declines in economic activity in 2020, and that's certainly been borne out more recently. Here in Australia, we learnt last week officially, as if we didn't need to be told that our record-breaking run of almost 30 years without a recession has now formally come to an end. Real GDP, the broadest measure of economic activity, declined by 0.3% in the March quarter. That was, of course, bookended by the bushfires in New South Wales, Victoria and South Australia at the beginning of the March quarter, and the first week or so of the shutdown at the end of the March quarter. But in the June quarter, which was reported last week, real GDP fell by 7%. And that is by far the biggest decline in any quarter since we first started reporting quarterly GDP back in the September quarter of 1959. And in fact, in annual terms, it's the biggest decline since 1946, when the Australian economy started to wind down after the end of World War II. And with that exception, of course, it's the biggest decline in Australia's economy since the Great Depression of the 1930s. As this chart shows in a bit more detail, where that big contraction in real GDP came from, it was particularly driven by substantial declines in consumer spending on discretionary goods and services. And I'll show you a bit more detail about that in a moment, but look at the chart in the bottom left-hand corner to see how large that decline in discretionary consumer spending was. In total, consumer spending fell by 12% in the June quarter, which is the biggest decline on record. And that happened despite the fact that household incomes were actually surprisingly well supported by government payments, job seeker, job keeper and the like, which more than made up for the loss of wages and salaries caused by people losing or being stood down from their jobs. Indeed, so big was the inflow of money from the government, and so limited were the opportunities that people actually had during the June quarter to go out and spend, so the proportion of household income which was saved rose to almost 20%, the highest it has been since the June quarter of 1974. That is some 46 years ago. Also contributing to the weakness in economic activity was a significant fall in business investment, not in the mining sector where investment actually increased marginally, but in the rest of the economy, in the manufacturing and services sectors, business investments fell quite significantly. And apart from the fall in imports that was associated with the decline in both household and business spending, the only positive contribution to economic growth in the June quarter came from public spending, particularly government consumption. That's the wages and salaries of public servants. And as it has been for some time, expenditure on schemes like the National Disability Insurance Scheme. Indeed, as the chart in the bottom right-hand corner that you can see shows, over the last 5 years, government spending has actually accounted for about half the growth in total economic activity, even though this measure of government spending only accounts for about 20% of GDP. It's accounted for more than twice as big a share of that as the growth in GDP. Just shows how dependent the Australian economy has been in the aftermath of the peak of the mining boom on ongoing support from government expenditure. This chart puts Australia's experience in a somewhat broader international context. What this chart shows is the change in the level of real GDP between the June quarter of 2019 and the June quarter of 2020. I've shown it in annual terms because for many of the 55 economies that have so far reported second quarter national accounts, the emerging economies among them in particular don't produce seasonally adjusted data that would allow you to compare the March quarter of this year with the June quarter. So instead, you have to compare the June quarter with the June quarter of the previous year. And you can see there that Australia's decline measured on that basis of about 6.3% over the year to the June quarter is at the better end of the outcomes that have been reported so far. The worst recession in the world over the year to the second quarter was in Macau, where GDP dropped by almost 50% over the year to the June quarter. That's, of course, because Macau's economy is extraordinarily dependent on tourism and gambling. There's not much else that happens there. And both of those activities, of course, have been heavily restricted. Then there are 3 other economies whose GDP have dropped by more than 4 other economies, I should say, whose GDPs have dropped by more than 20% over the year to the June quarter. That's the UK, Spain, India, and Peru. There's almost 25 economies whose GDP had fallen by between 10 and 20% over the year to the June quarter. And there are actually only 3 economies out of 55 so far which recorded some positive growth over the year to the June quarter. That's Vietnam, Georgia, and China, which of course recorded a huge decline over the year to the March quarter, but over the year to the June quarter, when they started to ease restrictions, having been shut down for most of the March quarter, the Chinese economy recorded positive growth. So I suppose bad as Australia's experience in the June quarter was by our own historical standards, by comparison with what other countries have experienced, it's perhaps not so bad at all. One other thing I'd note from this chart is that, crudely speaking, the countries which have had the worst experience in terms of economic decline have also been the ones who've had the worst experience of dealing with the virus, the highest numbers of infections and deaths per head of population. And that does reinforce the message that an important part of a sustainable recovery for Australia, as for any other economy, is actually getting on top of the virus and preventing a second or third wave of infections. Because if we do experience that, then I've no doubt we will have more negative growth than that. Just to provide a bit more insight into what caused the decline in real GDP in Australia in the second quarter, looking at the detail of household consumer spending, you can see that it was really big declines in spending on things like recreation and culture, transport services, hotels, cafes and restaurants, clothing and footwear, vehicle operation and purchase, the things you weren't allowed to do during the June quarter in most cases. That was what caused the 12.1% decline in consumer spending during the June quarter, whereas spending on household equipment, for example, or electricity, which people spent more on because they were confined to home. As you can see, they spent more on alcoholic beverages as well, Perhaps that's understandable in the context of people feeling shut in. They were the handful of things where spending actually went up in the June quarter by comparison with the March quarter. If we look at it from the production side of the Australian economy, what happened to the different 19 sectors of the Australian economy, you can again see a similar picture, that it was the decline in economic activity in areas like transport, postal and warehousing, accommodation and food services, and also construction and manufacturing, which are fairly large sectors of the Australian economy that helped produce that 7% decline in real GDP in the June quarter. It might seem surprising that activity in the healthcare and social assistance sector was down. That was, of course, because a lot of elective surgery was postponed or cancelled during the June quarter, and that would have been picked up in that sector. There are also, of course, as you can see, some big declines in sectors like art and recreation or professional and technical services, but large as those declines were, they're smaller as a proportion of the overall Australian economy, so they didn't contribute as much to the 7% decline as the declines in some of the larger sectors, such as manufacturing and construction. The ABS has been conducting some really useful surveys during the pandemic period that give us more insight or more timely insight into what's going on. And since there are a couple of folks from the ABS participating in this webinar today, let me thank you not just for being here, but for the work that you and your colleagues are doing that allows people like me to track how the economy is being affected by the virus and by government shutdowns in a way that wouldn't be possible otherwise. And I know that this has also been incredibly valuable to the policymakers who have to advise governments on what they should do about it, to have more timely information about what's happening in the Australian economy than, for example, they did during the global financial crisis of 12 years ago. And one of those surveys that the ABS has been conducting on a regular basis looks at how businesses have been affected in different ways. And the most recent survey, taken in the middle of August, tells us that there's still only about a quarter of all businesses that are operating as normal. The ones that are most affected by restrictions, the one where the fewest number of businesses are operating as normal, are obviously the ones you'd expect to be, such as accommodation and food services, or arts and recreation, or parts of retail. If we look at it by business size, it's perhaps worth noting that a slightly higher proportion of small businesses, around a quarter of them, are operating as normal. That's a higher proportion than the number of medium-sized or big businesses that are operating as normal, although there does seem to have been some recovery in the number of medium-sized businesses in particular from a very low level in the middle of June in particular. Another interesting result from this survey that the ABS produced of businesses is that even in August, when some of the restrictions had been eased, other than in Victoria, 40% of all businesses are still reporting lower revenue than they had in August 2019. And perhaps worryingly, 35% of businesses told the ABS that they would have trouble meeting financial commitments over the next 3 months. And if you look at the right-hand side chart again, you can see that the businesses most in that difficult position are those in the accommodation and food services sectors, perhaps not surprisingly, in transport and in the art and recreation sectors. Now, hopefully, as these surveys are conducted, we'll find fewer businesses reporting those difficulties in the future, but it's certainly something to keep an eye on. One of the areas where the shutdown has had its greatest effect on people, of course, has been in employment. And we saw during March and April around 800,000 Australians lose their jobs, either permanently or temporarily. And we know from the monthly labour force surveys that just under 40% of those, about 343,000 who lost their jobs, are now back at work. Most of them aren't working the same hours as they might have done beforehand, as you can see from the chart on the bottom left-hand corner. One of the things that prevented the unemployment rate from rising initially as much as might have been expected, given the number of people who lost their jobs or were stood down from them, was the fact that a lot of people who did lose their jobs dropped out of the workforce altogether. That's shown by the big decline in the labour force participation rate. And of course, people who did lose their jobs weren't required at that time to look actively for work in order to receive job seeker benefits as they otherwise might have been. And of course, many people, even if they wanted to go and look for work, wouldn't have been able to because of restrictions, or if they had been allowed to, would have not unreasonably concluded that there wasn't much chance of finding work. So for all of those reasons, the published unemployment rate initially didn't rise all that much. It has actually started to rise more over the last couple of months, July and August, because people who'd initially dropped out of the workforce not expecting to find work and thus not being counted as unemployed have started to look for work in the past 2 months, 86,000 of them, and that's pushed the unemployment rate up. Importantly, as I alluded to before, many of the people who have been able to go back to work haven't gone back to working the hours that they had been before the shutdown started. And that's reflected in the significant rise during March and April, and the subsequently only less than halfway fall in the proportion of people who are working part-time but say that they would like to and could work more hours if they are available. That's the underemployment ratio. And if you add the people who are underemployed to the people who are officially unemployed, and that's what the ABS calls the underutilization rate, then that is still at a very high level by historical standards of 18.7%. And that is much higher than we've seen during either of the past two recessions in the early 1990s or the early 1980s. The unemployment rate at July would have been 11.3% if people working 0 hours but nonetheless counted as employed because they were on JobKeeper, or people who, as I've mentioned before, had dropped out of the labour force altogether, were counted as unemployed, as they are, for example, in the United States and Canada in their labour force surveys. The effective unemployment rate, as the federal government calls it, would have peaked at 14.9% in April if we'd counted those people in those two positions as unemployed, rather than as either employed but working no hours or not in the labour force at all. That effective rate would have peaked at just under 15%, would have fallen to 13.9% in May, and would now have been down to 11.3%, as opposed to the 7.5% that's the official unemployment figure. Consistent with what the GDP figures have been telling us about what's been happening to the level of output, almost 60% of the job losses between February and May were in three sectors of the economy: accommodation and food services, education and training, and arts and recreation. It might seem a little surprising to see education and training there. I think a lot of that was the closure of schools and the shutdown of vocational education in some cases, as well as universities who haven't been able to attract overseas students and who aren't included in the JobKeeper program, incidentally. They've obviously had to lay off some significant numbers of staff because of the loss of revenue they've experienced. So that explains why education and training is among the sectors that have shed the greatest number of jobs between February and May. If we look by occupation, we can see that community and personal services workers, sales workers, and labourers have accounted for 3/4 of the job losses since February. That's February through May. We'll get data for August later this month, and that should show whether some of those people have been able to recoup their jobs since the middle of May when this survey was last taken. Partly because the job losses have disproportionately been in sectors like accommodation and food services, the arts and recreation, or education, women have accounted for a bigger share of job losses than men, 53% to 47%. That also partly reflects the fact that the occupations I mentioned before, of the three that have been most seriously affected, two of them, that is community services workers and people in sales workers, they're disproportionately women as well. Men, of course, more likely to be labourers, but that's the third most seriously affected category of occupations. If we look at age groups, initially people aged 15 to 34 accounted for 40% of total job losses. That was during the period between the middle of March and the middle of May. But quite a lot of those have got their jobs back during the period after then. But it's still the case that younger people have borne a greater share of job losses during this pandemic than people older than that. We've obviously got more limited information on what's happened during the September quarter, but for example, the well-regarded monthly business survey conducted by the National Australia Bank shows that there was some improvement in most of the components of business activity during July. We get the August numbers later this week, actually, so they'll be worth seeing to see whether outside of Victoria there has been a further improvement in the business condition. The mobility data that's compiled by Apple and Google based on how many pings they get as people go about different aspects of their lives clearly show what a drag Victoria has been on the national economy since the second wave began there. It really stands out in terms of the number of time, the amount of time people spend driving in Victoria compared with other states. But you can also see it too in the right-hand chart with the significant decline in Victoria in the amount of time spent working in comparison with the trends in the other 7 states and territories. Retail sales, we learnt last week, rose by 3.2% in July, even though they fell by 2% in Victoria. In the rest of Australia, they actually rose by almost 5%. Motor vehicle sales, which rose very strongly in June at the end of the financial year and a little bit more in July, fell by 22% in August. That was largely due to a 55% fall in Victoria, to a lower level than retail motor vehicle sales had been in Victoria during the worst of the first shutdown, that was in April and May. Of course, motor vehicle sales are a particularly discretionary spending item, so perhaps not surprising they fell as much as they did in Victoria during August. It's been surprising to many how well property prices have held up since the pandemic began. On average, between April and August, property prices have only fallen by 1.3%, a bit more than that in Melbourne and a little bit more than 1.3% in Sydney and in regional Western Australia. But in some cities, including Canberra, Adelaide and Hobart, property prices have actually gone up a little bit over the period since the pandemic began. Of course, that's been on pretty thin volumes, so you could argue that the property price outcomes are a bit unreal or a bit unrepresentative, but since people who might otherwise have had difficulty servicing their mortgages have been able to defer those repayments at least until the end of September and possibly for longer, there hasn't been a great deal of selling pressure in the property market. And although clearly there won't have been as much demand from migrants as there would have been, so far the sort of bearish scenarios that some people have painted of property prices falling by between 20 and 30% so far haven't come to pass. Now, that's still a risk when people have to start servicing their mortgages again if they've taken a holiday from that, as about 13% of mortgagees have done. But so far, those worst case scenarios haven't come to pass. The absence of immigrants is probably going to have a significant impact on house building once the work that's currently being done on projects that were already underway when the pandemic first hit has run its course. The government's home builder scheme, which combined with some of the incentives offered by state governments, especially in Western Australia and South Australia, has seen a significant increase in contracts being signed to build new homes. That may provide some support for dwelling construction activity over the second half of this year. But given that migrants typically account for 3/4 of the underlying demand for new housing year by year, and that we're not going to have any migrants probably at least until the second half of next year, and when we do, if the unemployment rate is still quite high, then probably the government won't allow the migration intake to go back to what it once was. I suspect we will see a further downturn in new dwelling construction, and I wouldn't be surprised if both the federal government and the state governments feel obliged to come forward with new schemes for stimulating the demand for housing as time goes by. As long as that doesn't put upward pressure on prices like these schemes normally do, I guess that's understandable, but hopefully governments won't overdo it as they did, for example, in the aftermath of the financial crisis. Turning to business again, business normally revises up their capital expenditure plans as the year progresses and as they report every 3 months to the ABS what their capital expenditure plans have been. But you can see from both these charts here that unusually businesses have been marking slightly in the case of the mining sector, a bit more obviously in the case of manufacturing and services, marking their investment spending plans for the coming financial year down. And that's not really a surprise given how uncertain the economic outlook is. Indeed, businesses tell the ABS in the same surveys that I quoted earlier that uncertainty about the future state of the economy is the biggest single factor weighing on capital expenditure decisions. And businesses are understandably reluctant to commit shareholders or proprietors' funds to expansion of their operations if they don't know whether there's going to be a demand for their products in the near term. I would expect business investment's going to be quite subdued for some time. Turning to our external trade, contrary to what happened during the financial crisis, commodity prices haven't really crashed with the exception of oil. Indeed, iron ore prices, that is the price of our most important commodity export, have in recent weeks hit their highest level since January 2014.